this.
We might offend someone.
Oh, who cares? It's the internet. We've already offended anyone by appearing on it. By identifying as males while being males. All right. Before this gets any sillier. Welcome to the Single Malt Review. It's not often you get something completely new and fresh on the Scotch whisky scene when your product takes a bare minimum of 3 years to even be legally called Scotch whisky, and many of the distilleries have been around literally for centuries. A new player is not something that happens often, but we're in that rare age where something new is going on. Yes, indeed. There are actually more than one new distilleries coming online, but Wolfburn is one of the very first to bring whisky to market. And when I say whisky, I only just mean whisky, because this is about 3 years and 3 seconds old. It's just coming in under the finish line, because this was distilled, as I very nonchalantly look at my notes, which have fallen out of my pants and are now on the floor. But it's distilled on the 25th of January 2013. So we're now in May, but this bottle, given some transit time, probably left Scotland's shores really very soon after it was 3 years old. So it's really just coming in, and it's probably, that makes it the youngest malt whisky, single malt whisky, that we've tried on the Single Malt Review. So it's a bit of a milestone in that respect.
And speaking of milestones, Wolfburn have been impressive for the way they've documented their whisky journey, as it were. Thanks to social media, the newfangled intertubes, and other such remarkable devices, we'll be able to follow the entire process from start to finish.
Now, they've been fairly good about letting on all the trials and tribulations of putting together a new distillery. Well, we say new. Getting into the fun facts of Distillery, Wolfburn, the name comes from the original Wolfburn Distillery, which, now that my notes have abandoned me completely, I don't know, but I believe, you can check this and correct me if you like, was founded in 1821, which is a hell of a long time ago, and it was decommissioned long since then. It was probably never an official distillery, was I to make a bet. It probably never had a distilling license, and certainly when the new managers of Wolfburn, which we will call semi-independent, it's one of these private consortiums with consent of the local council sort of a thing. I really don't know who's involved, but certainly none of the big spirit companies are, so independent as far as most things go at any rate. When they came to it, there was really nothing more than a pile of stones at the site of the distillery, but I'm sure they treated those stones with great respect. But what they did treat with respect was the water source. The original burn was still intact, so the water process and production that goes into Wolfburn whisky is the same as it would have been far more than 100 years ago. So if you're into your water archaeology, then I suppose that's relevant. But I'm sure they knew what they were doing when they sort of reactivated that particular spring.
So they essentially gave the €6 million treatment to the original site, rebuilt it, made it better, stronger.
More or less.
But kept it authentic.
I have sadly not been past in my recent trip in Scotland. I didn't go that far north, and we are talking very far north. This is the most northerly distillery in Scotland by, well, the Scottish mainland, I should say. Highland Park is further north, being up in Orkney. But as far as the mainland goes, this is north of all other distilleries by quite a fair few miles. It's really right up there. Really only a few kilometres north of John O'Groats, so we're talking right up on the north edge. Probably pretty fearsome weather that goes on up there. And it's from a place called Thurso, which doesn't sound very Scottish. That's because when you go that far north in Scotland, it actually becomes a bit Viking, a bit Scandinavian. So I'm not sure if that's something we're going to find in the whisky, what Scandinavia tastes like. We probably aren't really, come to think of it, but never mind. What we will do is have a wee look at what's going on in this very young whisky. See if it's bringing anything to the table that's worth your while at this very preliminary stage, because it is very preliminary. 3-year-old whisky is by far from complete.
That's pale, but that's the natural colour, but it's still an impressively dark colour for only 3 years. I've had 15, 17, 20-year-olds which have been this colour.
Certainly. This is second-hand information, but as far as I'm aware, this cask has been on something of a journey. I think it used to be a sherry cask, and it's been passed between a couple of different distilleries, the last one being in Islay. So a lot of this whisky's character, maybe too much, we will see, has been taken by association of what was previously aged in it, which was a peated Islay whisky, and that really comes through because this is unpeated malt, which can be quite confusing to people actually trying it, because, as we will find out, there is no small quantity of peated character coming in. But enough fluffing about with that, we should get into the whisky proper.
So
and see what's in there.
Sherry cask that's been possibly to Speyside, then possibly over to Islay, and then on to Wolfburn, and filled with unpeated spirit.
So we're going to call that a third fill, quite scientifically in this case.
It's a light, sweet body, quite a clear, fresh spirit note.
It is sweet, it's clean, and it is comparatively, especially if you're watching last episode's nightmarishly complex Highland Park, it's a very simple whisky. But 3-year-old whisky is always going to be simple. Whisky gains character and complexity as it ages. As it gets older, it picks up more nuance from the wood and more nuance from the age. What it gains versus what it loses is always in favour of gain. It loses that raw spirit, and as it gets very old, it can lose some of that youthful freshness. But what it picks up on the way is always more than what's left behind on its journey. This is just starting out, and so it's really only bringing these primary characters with it. So we have the sweetness from the malt, we have the fruitiness from the new make, and both of those you can taste in completely new white spirit. And by that, it really gives away how young it is. However, it's not harsh, and it is not savage like a lot of overly young whiskies can be, especially overly young grain whiskies. It still has enough character there. However, I think a lot of that character is coming maybe somewhat second-hand from that Islay cask. And I have no idea where it came from, what distillery, and I wouldn't want to hazard a guess because we're dealing with, parts per million of character coming through. But as anyone who's really into their whisky and their peat knows, parts per million is all you need to have peated flavour carry through. And this malt is unpeated. No peat went into this new make as far as I know.
Yet this whisky is very slightly peaty. It has distinctly got a faint touch of a peat to it.
There is more than a thread of peat winding its way through this. So by association with this cask, it's gained character that it otherwise wouldn't have, and I think it benefits markedly for it. So while it may not be a completely honest representation of a single malt, it certainly helps the product that's been put to market.
Yeah, that's an interesting conundrum, Matt, because in a way it's like it's acquired lots of its prestige or lineage or uniqueness from the cask, but at the same time, any other whisky does that too, from the bourbon or sherry or port that was in the cask beforehand.
Certainly. If you look at things truly scientifically, there really are very few single malts in the world, because casks lend so much to a whisky, and so often they bring in the presence of where they were before. Bourbon brings in the character and the presence of its bourbon distillery in the United States. Sherry, it brings through actual sherry, such that it actually colours the whisky in some cases with active casks coming through Jerez in Spain. Single malt becomes a tenuous term when you really start to think about it. And this one is no different. This one, I think, is garnering, to be completely honest, maybe a full quarter of its character from the cask that it's been in, and it absolutely benefits the product. However, I don't think it benefits the brand of Wolfburn, because it means we'll have to wait just that little bit longer to really see what Wolfburn's individual character is. Because it's very, very hard to discern in this case, because we are tasting so much of another distillery in it, which makes it a bit tough. Taking that completely aside and looking at this as a consolidated product, purely on its own, it's pretty good. And it's well priced at the moment. I'm not sure how universally available it is. There's certainly plenty floating around here, but we're in quite a unique position for good whisky allocations in an otherwise sort of a backwater as far as national whisky markets go. So I don't know how available it is where you're positioned to buy it. But
I think the age of social media has been kind to Wolfburn, and it's given them a degree of exposure, and also that back and forth, almost interactivity with the audience has meant that people have felt like a part of the process of creating it from the outset. It's not just a new thing that appears on the market and no one's heard of it. They've known about it from its inception, through its creation, its maturation, through to bottling. So that gives them a good kind of outreach, a good connection to people who are willing to buy it. So that may mean it's readily available. It's out there.
It's by no means an unpleasant whisky. In fact, it is a very pleasant whisky. It's a very primary whisky. It really brings primary flavours, sweetness, maltiness, core fruit flavours, which are by and large Speyside fruit flavours. They are white fruits, apples, pears, and just a little bit of stone fruit. There's no real distinct Highland character to it, and I think that's mostly just because it simply isn't old enough to express it. These more subtle flavours of heather, of violet, floral characters, they simply are more subtle, and when there are these sort of very, very strong, very punchy, youthful flavours, these loud flavours, you simply can't hear these quieter characters through this sort of cacophony the young whisky always presents itself as. So
I've added some water to that. That's awakened 3 major new elements for me. That's the heat, the peat, and the pears. It's distinctly hotter. There's a real burn of alcohol on the sinuses now, which is odd from adding water. The peat has been awakened more. It's much more lively, much more active at the forefront, and also just some juicy fresh pear.
It has spread it out a wee bit. I think to give this a score, and to be very fair, I'd have to give this one, in its current state, at 68 out of 100. I think it's a very, very strong start for a distillery, even if it is slightly hard to really cotton on to what Wolfburn itself is bringing. I will be fascinated to try their 6-year-old and their 10-year-old in the future. I think there's absolutely no reason why this can't blossom into a phenomenal malt, like we have seen so many new modern distilleries like Kilchoman become. They've just gotten stronger and stronger as their malt has aged. So 68 from me now, but with a very hopeful outlook to the future. What's your opinion?
I would also give it, what is by my standards, a comparatively low score of a 70. This whisky has things it wants to say, it has its own voice, but it's just not speaking up for now. It's got some flavours, some characters, but they're all a bit hesitant and a bit faint. Once it's had time, I'd say, like, when there's a 10-year-old Wolfburn out there, it'll have its own voice. And the fact that it's in these pre-loved, pre-used casks, that's going to contribute to a really unique style, but it needs time to develop. It's still very young, very raw, and not very nuanced at this stage. The things are, it's hinting at what's going to come, but it's not delivering it just yet.
Certainly something to keep an eye on, and it should be said, definitely be said, that this is priced very competitively at the moment. You should be able to pick this up for not a great deal of money at all, and I would, middling whisky though it may be at this point in time, I would recommend picking it up now, because in the future, when we're all tasting and raving about Wolfburn 10-year-old, which I'm fairly confident we will be, these modern distilleries, these modern craft distilleries, they're not mucking around. They are in it for the long term, and they will produce some remarkable malt when they get a little bit older. When that's all the rage, it will be that much more interesting for everybody if they've tasted where it came from. If you can say, yes, well, I had that when it was 3 years old, and I could see the beginnings of this lovely malt here.
That's a very important qualifier to the scores we've given, is that these scores and these opinions are formed on a spirit it is right at the cusp of what you can legally call Scotch whisky. This has only just begun, and it's already got characters, it's got potential, and it's starting to speak for itself. So that's something to bear in mind. There are whiskies which are much, much older than this, but which have far less to say and far less going on, really.
Yes, indeed. So, at any rate, this was Wolfburn's very first debut on the malt whisky market, and market, I should say. Market isn't even a word, but it's getting a bit late in the evening, never mind. Wolfburn's debut on the whisky market, and I think as far as whisky debuts go, for 3 years old, it's not bad. Certainly have a look if you're at all interested. You might just kick yourself later when they're winning all kinds of awards with their 8 or 10-year-old. Just think, maybe give them a try. Anyway, in the meantime, keep safe. This has been the Single Malt Review. Just think of where we'll be in 3 years. Sludger.